我哋會從兩個角度去睇一睇神究竟有咩應許咧喺聖經裏邊俾我哋。
And certainly we will be studying together, all the promises that God had given us, like from the Bible.
咁今年咧，我睇摩西佢自己嘅生平一啲嘅事蹟。
And certainly this year we shall be studying the life of Moses and the experiences, he encountered.
嗱，我唔知你中唔中意飲汽水咧？
I'm not so sure whether you like drinking pops.
有一隻好出名嘅汽水，可口可樂。
And there is a very popular pop drink, which is Coca-Cola.
咁佢每一年咧喺聖誕節咧都拍一啲廣告嘅。
So every year, Coca-Cola would advertise around Christmas year end.
咁啱啱過去一年咧，聖誕節咧，佢亦都拍咗一個廣告。咁咧，不過咧喺播出嚟咧，當然係30秒啦。我揾咗一個咧比較長啲嘅版本咧，咁我哋咧睇一睇。可能咧喺你嘅冇咗個聲音，但唔緊要，因為主要係睇個畫面嘅。
So this past year, Coca-Cola also put out a commercial around Christmas time. And it only lasts about 30 seconds, but there's a longer version. I'm going to show it to you. You might not hear the sound, but, it's important that you kind of see, just, the video.
爸爸咧就出去工作啦。
So Dad had to go out to work.
咁啊臨出去咧，佢個女封信。
So upon him leaving, the daughter, gave him a letter.
我封信咧就寄俾聖誕老人嘅喎。
So apparently the letter, was supposed to be sent to Santa Claus.
當佢發現咧，原來個女咁樣交咗佢啦，佢咧就即刻嗱臨去啦。
So therefore, Dad, remember the daughter's wish. So, he tried to get it as soon as possible to get it out.
但係中途咧都經歷好多唔同嘅波折。
But on the way, he encountered many different kind of mishaps.
佢都好努力，迎難而上。
So Dad worked very hard, to try to get the job done.
經歷過一段好艱難嘅旅程。
So he endured, such a long and hard journey.
佢嘗試去到北極，將啲封信俾聖誕老人。
So he was trying so hard to bring the letter, to Santa in the North Pole.
因為呢一個係個女嘅期望，亦都係佢對佢女嘅承諾。
Because, this was a promise he made to the daughter that, he had taken up this challenge.
容易地去到聖誕老人嗰度啦。
So he worked so hard and he finally arrived at Santa's place.
聖誕老人屋企咧，因為聖誕節所以去放假。
Apparently Santa, already, was on vacation because of Christmas.
上咗個可口可樂嘅車。
So somehow, eventually, Dad got into this truck, that was transporting Coca-Cola.
臨走就聖誕老人就將嗰個司機俾一封信佢，原來個女咧寫住聖誕老人，請你將爸爸平安帶翻嚟過聖誕。
So eventually, a trucker gave him back the letter, and what the message in the letter was please bring Dad home for Christmas.
當然呢個係廣告啦。
Certainly, that was commercial.
係咪啊？咁咧，你睇唔睇呢個廣告都知道飲咗啲罐可樂都好 sweet 㗎。
So certainly, even if you don't buy into the commercial, drinking Coca-Cola would kind of give you a sweet taste.
弟兄姊妹，整個嘅告白拍得好靚，其實唯一一個好緊要嘅因素就係承諾。
Such a beautiful commercial, but the entire message, in this commercial, is very much about a promise.
父母可能對兒女嘅承諾，兒女對父母嘅承諾。
Certainly, parents make promises to their children, and children also make the same to their parents.
大家都要好努力嘅去實踐出嚟。
So both parties work very hard to try to fulfill these promises.
或者當我哋要實踐承諾嘅過程嘅裏邊，我哋都會面對好多唔同嘅挑戰。
Certainly, when we try to fulfill promises, that we may encounter many sorts of challenges.
好容易去令到我哋泄氣、放棄或者灰心。
Quite easily, we could become discouraged, that we feel that, we just have to give up.
但係如果我哋持守緊嗰個嘅承諾，成為你裏邊嘅動力，你能夠克服各樣嘅挑戰。
But yet, if we take to these challenges and try to work hard to fulfill these promises,
咁你會得到承諾背後最終嘅帶俾你嘅祝福。
And certainly you will be rewarded, with the blessings that will come with fulfilling these promises.
約書亞記23章、24章。
So in the book of Joshua, like chapter 23 and 24,
講到約書亞帶領以色列人進入神俾佢哋嘅應許地。
It speaks of how Joshua led the Israelites into the land that God had promised them.
摩西喺個曠野漂流咗40年。
So Moses, and the Israelite, they kind of wandered, in the desert for 40 years.
約書亞去接助摩西帶領以色列人，用咗7年多嘅時間去進入打倒趕退敵人，而係讓以色列人可以平安分地，以後安居樂業。
So for 7 years, Joshua, took up the baton from Moses and trying to ward off, some of the enemies around and bringing, the Israelites finally into the land that God has promised them.
去到23章嘅時候，其實係講到一個嘅情況，約書亞分好地啦，準備同呢班以色列人可能會離別。
So in chapter 23, it speaks of finally, all these challenges were settled, that they had divided the land, and Joshua was just about to depart, from the group.
約書亞去諗點樣先能夠幫助呢班以色列人能夠繼續係走前邊嘅道路。
So Joshua must be thinking, what could I do, to help the Israelites to continue, to walk on their journey, on with God.
約書亞鼓勵當時嘅以色列人找緊神自己嘅應許。
So Joshua encouraged the Israelites then that they have to seize hold and heart of God's promises to them.
因為唔知道前邊係或好或壞。
For, they weren't sure of what was to come, whether it was good or it was worse.
有乜嘢嘅挑戰，有咩嘅艱難。
What sorts of challenges, what sorts of difficulties lying ahead of them.
約書亞好相信，如果每一個信徒能夠找緊神自己嘅應許，佢仍然能夠喺困難嘅當中不斷嘅前進。
So Joshua trusted that, if Christians could seize hold of God's promises, then no matter what lied ahead, that they would be able to overcome these challenges.
2021年
The year 2021.
踏入2021年，究竟前邊2021年係比2020年係好定壞呢？
So entering into a new year 2021, would it be better than the year past or not?
當然啦，你同我都好希望係更好嘅。
So certainly you and me, we wish for a better year.
但我哋唔知啊。
But yet, we are not sure. We don't know.
我哋唔知係或好或壞。
We're not sure whether, it would be good or it would be worse.
或者有乜嘢特別嘅挑戰擺喺你同我嘅面前。
Or what sorts of challenges would be lying ahead of us, for you and for me.
但我相信，如果你同我都能夠找緊神俾我哋人生裏邊嘅應許，我哋能夠可以喺逆境嘅當中，仍然帶着主嘅平安，享受神俾我哋嘅2021年。
But we trust that, as we seize hold of God's promises, that, we would be able to overcome, these challenges and walk on with God in this journey. 咁
今日就讓我哋一齊喺約書亞記23章14到16節嘅時候，我哋去了解究竟乜嘢叫做應許，應許對我哋有咩咁重要。
So for today, we're going to study Joshua, like chapter 23, like verses 14 to 16, and to really understand, what promise or fulfilling promise, was about.
你留意喺第14節一開始嘅時候，約書亞咁樣講：我現在要走世人嘅必走的路。
If you were to pay attention, like verse 14 at the beginning, Joshua said, "Now I'm about to go the way of all the earth."
嗱，可能咧，裏邊可能有好多嘅寓意。
Perhaps, this statement was laden with a lot of meanings.
可能約書亞話：嗱，你有你嘅路，我有我嘅路，係咪？
Perhaps Joshua was hinting that, well, you have your way and I have my way, like to go on.
或者可能約書亞有一個感觸。
Or perhaps Joshua might have some sort of a sentiment in his heart.
可能我都一把年紀啦。
He might be thinking, well, I'm coming of age.
可能我都慢慢走向人生嘅末了，更加近啦。
And perhaps, I'm closer, to the end of my life as well.
走到人生嘅末了嘅時候，約書亞喺當中，佢諗起自己，亦都諗起當時嘅以色列人。
So coming to the end, of his life, like Joshua, not only thinking about himself, but also, the life of the Israelites.
嗱，你諗下，約書亞佢主要嘅工作就係帶領以色列人進入應許地啊。
So perhaps looking back, you knew that Joshua's main mission was to bring the Israelites into God's promised land.
喺當時佢嘅工作可以話已經完咗啦。
So at the time, he had already fulfilled his mission.
佢可以講一句話：你哋以後乜嘢嘅情況唔關我事。
So he could be saying something like, whatever is going to happen to you, well, it's not my business anymore.
但係約書亞好愛當時嘅以色列人。
But yet Joshua loved, the Israelites.
佢好擔心，如果分咗地之後，佢哋喺應許地，佢哋會唔會繼續去愛神？會唔會繼續行神自己嘅路？
Joshua worried that, now that they have divided up the land, in the promised land, whether, they would continue to trust God and live with God, or, something else might happen to them.
冇錯，喺當時佢哋分到地係一個祝福，但係得到呢個祝福之後，究竟係祝福定係咒詛咧？
Certainly, the Israelites had divided up, their land, and for that fact, it was a blessing. But what might happen, if they don't take hold of this blessing?
約書亞諗到呢一度嘅時候，內心裏邊充滿一種感觸。
So certainly, Joshua, had something move, his heart right at this time.
所以喺呢一度嘅時候，約書亞提醒佢哋，佢同佢哋話：你們神所應許賜福與你們的話，沒有一句落空，都應驗在你們身上啦。
So therefore, Joshua, said it to the Israelites, with all your heart and soul that not one of all the good promises the Lord your God gave you has failed. Every promise has been fulfilled.
約書亞提醒佢哋神嘅應許。
Josh reminded, the Israelite, about God's promises to them.
神嘅應許起初臨到佢哋嘅身上。
So God's promises first kind of reaching them.
神嘅應許雖然經歷好多嘅艱難，但係喺佢哋嘅身上能夠實現咗啦。
So despite all the difficulties and hardship they encounter, but God's promises, had all been fulfilled.
約書亞好想同當時嘅人講：你如果前路可能面對有好多嘅困難，但係神應許你繼續俾你存留，你放心，抓住神嘅應許，努力前進。
So Joshua was telling them, now see, God had fulfilled his promises to you. So even going ahead, you might be facing many more challenges, but as long as you seized hold of God's promises, that, your pathway ahead would be fine.
點解約書亞咁看重神嘅應許？
So why did Joshua place such emphasis on God's promises then?
我好相信喺當陣時，約書亞喺佢人生裏邊都作咗一個好緊要嘅反省。
So I trust that at the time Joshua, probably for himself, on a personal level, that, he had also reflected upon his very own life.
約書亞好似你同我面對未知嘅前路嘅時候，都會充滿好多嘅恐懼、憂慮或者戰兢。
So like you and me, Joshua, probably, when you face, with all the uncertainties, about the future, that you probably, would be afraid, you would be scared, and you would be worried.
當佢接續摩西要帶領以色列人進入埃及嘅時候，進入應許地嘅時候。
When he took up the baton from Moses and knowing that, he had to lead the Israelites, into God's promised land.
去了解乜嘢叫以色列人。
He understood, what the Israelites was about.
個個都好有性格。
So certainly, each one of them, they had their own character traits.
未必咁容易合作。
It might be very difficult for them to collaborate and work and cooperate together.
擺喺面前有好多外邦嘅敵人。
And what they were facing at the time, there were many enemies, from the Gentiles.
或者佢都了解到，中國有一句説話：猛虎不及地頭蟲啊！
And Joshua probably knew that even though you could be strong and tough, but somehow you probably couldn't fight with the local hooligans.
佢要進入應許地，佢當時知道呢個消息，佢內心都充滿好多嘅恐懼、憂慮或者重擔。
So going into the promised land, probably what filled Joshua's hearts and mind, were fear, and worries and anxieties.
但係當佢憂慮、恐懼嘅時候，神向佢說話。
But when he was afraid, he was anxious and worried, then God spoke to him.
神對約書亞講，佢話：你當剛強壯膽，因為你必使這百姓承受那地為業，就是我向他們列祖起誓應許給他們的地。只要剛強，大大壯膽。謹守遵行我僕人摩西所吩咐你的一切律法，不可偏離左右，使你無論往哪裏去都可以順利。
So God's promise spoke to Joshua, be strong and courageous because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses has given you. Do not turn from it. And such that, you would go.
冇錯，佢有憂慮恐懼，但係當佢信靠神自己嘅應許嘅時候，佢就將一切嘅憂慮、恐懼、掛慮嘅嘢交託俾神，找住神嘅應許，努力前進。
So even though, he might have worries and anxiety, but he seized hold of what God had promised him, then, he just charge on and continue the path.
7年嘅就打勝好多嘅仗，甚至可以幫助以色列人去分地，可以等佢哋安居樂業。
So in 7 years that, he won the battle, against his enemies and also divided up the land and helped the Israelites to settle.
弟兄姊妹喺2021年，
So brother and sister, in the year 2021,
可能你都可以繼續擁抱住你嘅憂慮、你嘅恐懼，或者你嘅掛。
Perhaps, in this new year, you could continue to embrace and cuddle, your own fears and worries and anxieties.
啲都係正好自然嘅反應。
Perhaps, these are very normal, just human reactions.
但2021年，請你記住第一個嘅主日。
But yet, for the year 2021, today is the first Sunday worship.
無論喺2021年發生咩嘅事情，請你記住神嘅應許。
So regardless of like what may happen, in this year, but always remember, God's promises.
當你困難，當你有壓力嘅時候，請你緊記神向你嘅應許。
So when you're stressed, when you face challenges, that, always remember God's promise to you.
神俾得你生存，俾得你更有恩典，神應許與我哋嘅同在。
God has allowed you to live, He has given you promises that, He has promised that He'll be with us all steps of the way.
神向約書亞嘅應許，神亦都向你發出嘅應許，只要剛強，大大嘅壯膽，謹守摩西嘅一切嘅律法，無論你往哪裏去，神必與你同在。
So like God's promise to Joshua, today, God has made the same promise to you. Be strong, and that, He will, protect and support us.
所以約書亞要帶俾我哋一個好緊要嘅信息，神嘅應許係推動我哋繼續嘅前進。
So Joshua, gave us a very important message. God's promise is the drive, to keep us going forward.
你唔好再擁抱住憂傷或者掛慮，請你擁抱住神自己俾你嘅應許，繼續前進。
So no longer to embrace sadness, and worry, take on God's promise and continue to go forward.
因為神喺前面有更美嘅祝福等緊你。
For God, has, greater blessings, waiting, for you ahead of the road.
保羅喺侍奉裏邊都面對好多唔同嘅挑戰同埋難處。
So the Apostle Paul, he also faced many challenges, and barriers when he tried to preach the gospel.
但係保羅特別喺哥林多睇下笪地方。
But yet, when he was in the Corinth area,
但係保羅寫哥林多前書嘅時候，佢咁樣講。
When Apostle Paul wrote the book of Corinthians, at the beginning he said something like this.
我邀請你一齊讀好冇？
And I encourage you to read God,
你們原是被他所召，好與他兒子，我們的主耶穌基督一同得分。弟兄姊妹，我哋嘅神係信實嘅。
Brother and sister, our God, is a faithful God.
神期望你同耶穌一同去得分。
God expects you, like Jesus himself, to go into fellowship, together with him.
你唔係孤單嘅，耶穌同你一齊。
You're never alone because Jesus, is always there with you.
去行你自己繼續嘅人生路。
Continue to walk on your life journey.
真係，我哋一同得分，亦都得分。F-U-N.
So certainly, not only that we have fellowship, with Christ Jesus, but, we also have fun as well.
姊妹，放心，平安，喜樂。
Brother and sister, be contented, enjoy the peace and joy within you.
但當約書亞講到應許，究竟喺約書亞嘅腦中裏邊，乜嘢嘅應許？
So when Joshua was talking about promise, God's promise, what kind of promise, was he thinking about?
請你留意第14節後半節。
So let's pay attention to the second half of verse 14.
約書亞強調講到應許嘅時候，佢強調所講嘅就係耶和華你們神所應許賜福給你們的話，沒有一句落空，都應驗在你們身上啦。
So when Joshua thought of promises, he exactly was thinking about not one of all the good promises the Lord your God gave you had failed. Every promise has been fulfilled.
弟兄姊妹，當你話我神有應許，但究竟乜或者神嘅應許有幾咁重要喺你嘅信念裏邊？
So certainly when we think of God's promise, but how significant, God's promise, had been, in your hearts and mind.
嗱，喺約書亞喺當中表達嘅時候，最少有兩個嘅意思。
So in Joshua's, expression, at least there were two meanings that derived from it.
嗱，神俾你嘅應該係好嘅 ，good promise。
So God had given you all the good promises.
嗱，弟兄姊妹嘅時候，神嘅應許係好啊，所以如果你遇到唔好嘅事情嘅時候咧，你唔好第一樣嘢就話：哎呀，神點解咁樣整我？
So all the promises from God, they are good. So even though you get stuck, never to think that why did God allow this to happen to me?
找住神俾我應該係好嘅，所以我哋勇往直前。
So seize hold of the promises, they are all good from God. Therefore, we are motivated to go forward.
神要提醒當時嘅以色列人，神嘅應許會實現嘅。
So God wanted to assure the Israelites that, God will fulfill his promises.
呢句說話你唔好輕看喎。
So never to take light, of this statement.
曾幾何時以色列人去懷疑過神㗎？
So, there have been times when the Israelites started to doubt God.
哎呀，出埃及啊咁辛苦，翻轉頭。
So, leaving Egypt, it was so hard. Perhaps we should turn around and go back.
或者可能懷疑過呢個係咪神嘅心意？
Or certainly questioning, whether, that was truly God's
當一
will
問
for
題
them.
嚟嘅時候，好多嘅負面就充滿落去。
So, when, they face difficulties, they started to doubt themselves and doubt God as well.
約書亞要提醒當時嘅以色列人，你睇下，今日我哋踏進應許地啦，神嘅應許唔會落空㗎。
So Joshua wanted to remind the Israelites, look at now that we had reached the promised land. So God's promises, to us have been all fulfilled. Not one had failed.
弟兄姊妹喺呢一度，約書亞表達到佢對神嘅應許有一種好強嘅信念，係好嘅，係會應驗嘅。
So Joshua had such a strong faith, trusting that all God's promises, they were good and God would fulfill all of them.
約書亞係一個將軍。
Joshua, was a commander, a general.
佢知道打仗。
He knew about warfare.
打仗好緊要啊，大家兵力比較啫嘛。
Certainly, fighting a battle, you need to have good army, comparing, with your enemy.
當佢打耶利哥城嘅時候，
So when Joshua, was fighting in the battle of Jericho,
按實力冇可能打贏嘅。
apparently according to, what they had in terms of armed force, they would never, have been able to win.
神叫佢哋點打？以色列人唔好出聲，喺佢圍住個城係咁圍幾日，跟住最後一日嘅時候咧，圍完嘅時候就大叫，咁啊成個冧咗。
So God told them for the Israelites not to make any noise, but they shall walk around the city of Jericho for 7 days, and at the end of 7 days, they all kind of scream out, and then eventually, the entire city crumbled to the ground.
約書亞經歷，當佢聽從神吩咐嘅途徑嘅時候，佢經歷到得勝並且得勝。
So Joshua learned that, if he followed closely, what God had instructed him to do, then, he would win.
嗱，當約書亞打耶利哥城之前嘅時候，佢有一個經歷，就係喺夜晚裏邊嘅時候，佢見到一個嘅人，呢個人表達我係要作耶和華軍隊嘅元帥。
Apparently, before his battle, in Jericho, Joshua had some sort of an experience, and somehow that experience of as a commander of the army of the Lord, that I have now become.
約書亞第一個嘅意思冇諗到就係佢話：哇！你嚟搶我飯碗啊！
So Joshua never thought that, are you going to kind of take away my job now?
佢知道神向佢顯現。
So Joshua trusted that, God had revealed himself to him.
作為一個將軍，就謙卑自己，讓神成為佢軍隊裏邊嘅元帥。
So apparently, as a commander of the army, he humbled himself that, he let God to be the commander, of his entire army.
所以佢聽從神好奇異嘅圍城嘅方法。
So he listened to, this very interesting, battle strategy, what God had put out for him.
最終打勝耶利哥城。
So eventually, they won the battle, at Jericho.
信念
Believes.
如果今日問大家，你對神嘅應許你相信嗎？100個弟兄姊妹一定話信，係咪？
So if I were to ask you this question, do you trust, in God's promises? And then I bet most of you would affirmatively say that, yeah, sure, we trust, in God's promises to us.
我唔係挑戰你，究竟你嘅信念係乜嘢？不過我想提醒你，我哋唔係淨係信咁簡單，或者我哋要相信，甚至我哋裏邊有幾擁抱，有幾確信，係導致我哋能唔能夠面對勝過困難一個好緊要嘅關鍵。
So I'm not trying to challenge you, but I think that, in terms of belief and trust, how much it is, how much trust, how much, did we believe, in God's promises, that would be the key, as we face all these challenges.
困難往往係最好去試煉或者驗證我哋嘅信念究竟有幾強。
Troubles oftentimes, are good testing. Their trials to see, how much, we have trust and faith in certain things.
好多時困難嚟到嘅時候，我哋腦裏邊充滿好多嘅疑問，好多嘅疑慮，甚至好多嘅疑惑。
A lot of the times when troubles come our way, that immediately and automatically, we would have a lot of questions, worries, and doubts.
以致我哋喺困難嘅裏邊跌低。甚至離棄
such that, it's easy for us to fall down or, somehow, we have given up completely.
如果我哋嘅信念清楚嘅話
But yet, if our beliefs, are clear.
當困難嚟到嘅時候，我知道神嘅意念係好嘅，神嘅意念一定實現嘅，一定 fulfill 嘅，我哋就擺低呢啲嘅疑慮，繼續前行。
When we have such a firm and clear faith that even though the troubles may come our way, but, we will be able to continue to charge on, seizing hold and believing, in God's promises, to us, and continue the life journey.
賓頓福音宣教會
Brampton Evangelical Missionary Church.
我哋喺開始嘅時候，我哋都係憑信心開始。喺我哋嘅整個過程，我哋經歷好多唔同嘅挑戰。
So when we first started, as a group that, we faced many challenges, and over the years, we also have encountered many different types of troubles.
我哋最近去辦理嗰個物業嘅名稱嘅轉讓。
So recently, we tried to tackle assuming, the title, for the church premise.
最初 after 我哋去 merge 咗之後嘅時候，去總會話我哋成為一個 full member， 跟住咧我哋就可以申請轉名啦。
So at the beginning, when we merged, with the original church, that somehow, we had the notion that, we then would become a full member of the missionary denomination, and then, we can have our title transfer over.
我哋當新進行嗰個嘅 full member 嘅過程，我哋都經歷好多人事嘅變遷。
And certainly when we were processing to become a full member of the evangelical missionary denomination, that, we experienced quite a significant turnover in our congregation.
唔單止教會人事嘅變遷，總會亦都有好多人事嘅變遷。
not only like changing of personnel, like, within the church, but also within, the denomination as well.
當我哋完咗做 full member，我哋又要做 incorporate，我哋又辦理咗呢啲嘅手續嘅時候，當我哋去接合。
So when we completed, like, the becoming full member, and then we applied for incorporation, and then so we can connected, with the national body, to try to have the title or to process for the title transfer.
我哋問咗好幾個當中一啲嘅負責人，佢哋話我哋嗰個 policy 轉咗啦，我哋唔會俾你嘅，我哋會需要你買。
So we asked like several of the officials, in the denomination, and then somehow like several of them had indicated that, well, it would not be no fee kind of like transfer, likely that you would have to purchase out like, the building.
喺我哋咁細嘅教會，我哋點可以買呢？
For us, such a small congregation, we would not have the financial ability, like, to purchase the building.
就算半價，我哋都買唔起啦。
So even though, if it's half price, that, we would not have been able to purchase the
或
premise.
者可能係90% off，我哋都買唔起啊。
Or even like, if it's 90% off, that paying 10%, we would not have been able to afford.
雖然總會嘅話，放心，我哋會俾個好嘅價錢你。
So even though like, the national body, had assured us that, they would, they had promised us, to give us like a better deal.
我哋喺唔同嘅時代個 trustee 又好，或者我哋嘅 board member， 我哋都同過唔同嘅一啲總會嘅負責人傾過，佢哋俾我哋嘅消息都係咁樣。
So apparently the message was fairly consistent even over time. Some of our trustee, some of our board members, had tabled like the same issues, with them.
甚至我哋最後同負責財務嘅，佢特登嚟我哋教會傾嘅時候，佢一坐低唔同啦，轉晒啦，冇以前咁噶啦。
So even eventually, our last meeting, with our church financial officer, that, so he basically, was sending us a message that, yeah, because there had been policy changes that, things would not be like, how it was done before.
我好記得當日我車佢返去酒店嘅時候。
So I remember after the meeting on that day, I drove him back to the hotel.
我將我哋教會嘅歷史講一次俾佢哋聽。
So I share with him, like, the history, of how, our congregation, our church, had come about.
我哋唔係接咗個 building， 而係過去我哋同以前嘅西人教會做咗一個 merge。
So it wasn't that, we start, our own kind of congregation. It was more like we merged, with the then existing church, at the time when we first began.
我好講完之後，佢話係啊，而家唔同咗啦。
So even at the end, he said something to me that, yeah, things had changed like quite a bit, like, since then.
而第二日我哋有機會一齊食晏嘅時候，佢一見到我，佢同我講一句説話。
So the next day, we met up for lunch, and when he saw me, he said something like this.
佢話 Simon， 你尋日同我講，我諗一諗，可能你哋嘅情況係有啲唔同。
So he said to me that, Pastor Simon, what you told me yesterday, and I thought about it. And yeah, you're right. Perhaps your situation, was somewhat different.
你俾啲時間我去了解。
So please, give me some time for me to try to kind of think this through and get some understanding.
跟住好感謝神，最少佢肯聽啦。
So I praise the Lord because at least, he was willing to listen.
跟住呢一個嘅弟兄就 喺佢好困難嘅 position 嘅裏邊，去嘗試幫我哋去 present。
So certainly, this brother in Christ, it was difficult, because of his official kind of like position, within the national body. But he, was willing, to present this like on our behalf.
因為 pandemic， 所以原本嘅開會嘅時間有 delay 咗。
So because of pandemic, the original like set time, had to be changed.
跟住嘅時候，就因為呢個嘅情況，總會了解到我哋整個嘅圖畫去願意跟最初嘅承諾去將嗰個 building 嘅 title 去 transfer 俾我哋教會。
So after some thought, the board had time and eventually, arrived at a decision that, they would honor the original kind of promise, like to us, that they would be willing, to transfer the title, like from the denomination, onto us.
跟住呢一個嘅弟兄喺因為 pandemic， 所以佢唔能夠繼續係做呢個財務嘅工作。
And after, a bit, because of the pandemic, this brother, also moved on, and was not able to continue with his kind of original financial, as a financial officer of the denomination.
當我回顧嘅時候
As I look back,
呢個過程我哋都會經歷好多嘅困難，但係當我哋找住神嘅應許，神去嘅時候，神弟兄姊妹
brothers and sisters,
係咪 off 咗？我哋有冇 ？OK， is it okay now?
yeah, now, yeah, you're
Okay,
back.
sorry about that. Maybe some the technical, the issue, and so I hope you can see it right now. Okay, so okay，喺賓頓福音宣教會總括嚟講嘅時候，我哋好相信神喺你我嘅人生裏邊會去帶領。雖然經歷嘅困難，但係找住神嘅應許，我哋一定可以迎難而上。
So like, the Brampton Church, even though we face challenges, and maybe for us, we also face challenges, but if we were to hold on to God's promises, that, we would be set firm, and continue our life journey holding on to God's promises to us.
弟兄姊妹，當我哋點解我講出嚟？當我哋就算將來接到呢一個嘅建築物嘅時候，係好唔好嘅時候，我哋都要找緊神嘅應許，以致將來一個嘅困難，我哋都可以衝過。
So I share this with you, that about like, the title transfer of our church, so as we go forward, whether, it was a good thing or a not so good thing for us to have this building, I want brother and sister to know that we just have to hold on to God's promise to us and just walk on.
嗱，弟兄姊妹，當我哋繼續睇呢段經文嘅時候，你留意約書亞提醒我哋一樣嘢。
Certainly, as we continue to read the scripture, Joshua wanted to remind us of this thing.
如果我哋有好對神有一個好清楚嘅信念，請你記住，約書亞點講？佢話：你們是一心一意的知道。
So let's say, we have this knowing about God, like Joshua was saying, with all your heart and soul.
嗱，弟兄姊妹，約書亞其實想我哋了解嘅時候，呢個知道唔係單係理性嘅知道。
So Joshua wanted to emphasize, this knowing, it's never just about like rationally we know.
而你內心係深深嘅知道。
But yet deep in your heart, you also have this inner knowing.
而你整個嘅內心嘅心情好擁抱住神係好嘅，神嘅應許唔會落空嘅。
And holding on to in your heart and soul that, God's promises to us are good and all the promises will be fulfilled.
呢個係需要我哋整個嘅人完全嘅擁抱住神自己嘅應許，靠住呢個信念能夠勇往直前。
So this is a knowing, that is embodied in our hearts and mind, such that, we trust, we have full faith that God's promises are good and He will fulfill them.
神嘅應許推動我哋前進，但係我哋需要咩啊？完全整個嘅人去擁抱住神自己嘅應許，以至你經歷真正應許帶俾你嘅祝福。
So not only God's promises motivate us to go forward, He also, needs us to embrace it wholeheartedly, such that, we shall kind of go forward.
所以喺馬可福音裏邊，耶穌鼓勵你同我要盡心盡性盡意盡力去愛主你嘅神，其次就是說要愛人如己，仲有比這兩條誡命嘅更大的念。
So like Mark, in the Gospel of Mark, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, your mind and your strength, and also love your neighbor as yourself. And there is no commandment greater than these.
弟兄姊妹，鼓勵你同我一齊擁抱住神自己嘅應許。
Brother and sister, I encourage you, let us all embrace God's promise to us.
如果你留意第15節嘅時候，約書亞跟住咁樣講。
So in verse 15, Joshua continued to say,
佢話耶和華你們神所應許的一切嘅福氣，怎樣臨到你們身上，耶和華也必照樣使各樣嘅禍患臨到你們身上，直到把你們從耶和華你們神所賜的這美地上除滅。
Verse 15, Joshua said, but just as every good promise of the Lord your God has come true, so the Lord will bring on you all the evil He has threatened until He has destroyed you from this good land He has given you.
通常我哋講到應許，我哋嘅腦裏邊就係充滿啦，好啊好啊，祝福啊祝福啊。
Certainly, when we think of like promises that, we always look to, yeah, everything is good, like good will come our way.
神嘅同在，神嘅安慰，神嘅供應，哇，樣樣好啊。
So God's promise, God's presence, and God's provisions, they are all good.
喺呢一度嘅時候，約書亞提出應許嗰種兩方面嘅層面。
But yet here Joshua also brought out there are two sides to the promise.
講到好祝福嗰一邊，但係當你唔去緊守神嘅應許嘅時候，嗰種嘅咒詛嘅另一面。
So, when you seized hold, of the promise, it was all good. But on the other hand, if you revolt and you rebel and you become disobedient, there also come the other side, of the promise.
約書亞好了解人性，好了解當時嘅以色列人。
Joshua, had a true understanding of character traits and also understood, what the Israelite, was struggling with.
約書亞冇俾一個一大堆嘢佢哋提佢哋。
So Joshua, didn't lay down what they should or should not do, in a long haul.
我相信以下約書亞提咗3樣嘢。
But certainly, Joshua only identified at least 3 things.
呢3件事就係當時以色列人常犯嘅問題，亦都係人類常犯嘅問題。
And these are the 3 things that the Israelite, had fallen, and also, for most of us, even like to this day, that the things that we always violated.
就係第一樣嘢就係違背耶和華你們神吩咐你們所守嘅約啊。
First, was like, they or even us violate the covenant of the Lord of God, which he commanded us.
違背神嘅聖約。
So to violate like the covenant of God.
第二嘅去侍奉別神。
And secondly, to go and serve other gods.
將你嘅時間，將你嘅心思去才幹去做喺特別嘅地方嘅裏邊，而忽略咗神。
So to invest, your gifts, your time, your energy, onto something else other than God himself.
甚至去敬拜佢哋。
And even to the point of like, bowing down to them.
將你嘅心唔係俾神，將你嘅心獻過俾別嘅。
So give your heart not to God, but to these things.
呢啲就係以色列人或者人性裏邊常犯嘅錯誤。
So these are like, some of the human nature, and also for the Israel, then, that they always, got themselves into trouble.
我相信約書亞唔係隨意講。
Certainly, I didn't think Joshua would say it lightly.
記唔記得當摩西上山去攞法版嘅時候，以色列人見摩西咁耐都唔落嚟，可能話佢哋已經死咗啦。
So remember, the incident when Moses was up on the mountain and trying to get the template from God, that, people, the Israelite, down low in the mountain, and they were saying, well, what happened to him? Did he die?
嗰啲嘅人就即刻攞晒自己啲金尾裏邊打咗一個嘅牛族，又話呢個就係佢哋嘅神啦，帶領佢哋繼續去走前邊嘅路。呢個就係以色列人啦。
So the Israelite at the time, because of not knowing, what actually had happened, so when they didn't see Moses back, so they started to put out their gold, and then they made a golden calf, and trusting that, it would be a God that they could follow and take them out of like, the wilderness.
或者呢個係人性，當面對困難嘅時候，睇唔到下一步，好容易就用自己嘅方法。揀選一條錯誤嘅路。
So this is very typical for human beings, when we couldn't see the future, that we would rely on ourselves. We found a way that we believed would kind of like take us out of our trouble.
約書亞喺23章同以色列人咁樣講。
So Joshua in chapter 23, in the book of Joshua, he said to the Israelites,
佢唔係要令到以色列人傷心。
He never was trying to break the hearts of the Israelites.
佢唔係要挖苦以色列人。
Certainly, he was not trying to ridicule them.
約書亞可能諗到，佢唔知仲有冇機會見翻呢啲以色列人，佢好想希望佢哋嚟緊行得好，走得到。
So Joshua wasn't sure whether, he would be able to continue kind of walking, with these Israelites. So therefore, he wanted to leave a message. He wanted to caution them.
所以約書亞用佢嘅說話去鼓勵以色列人好好抓住應許。
So Joshua, continued to say encouraging words to the Israelites and prompt them, to continue to seize hold of God's promises to them and follow.
約書亞係一個將軍。
Joshua, was the commander of an army.
佢知道完成一個工作最緊要兩樣嘢。
So he knew,
清楚你嘅命令，跟隨嘅命令。
So he knew that when you had an order, you need to follow the order. There are 2 very significant things.
神嘅話語好清楚，好好找住神嘅話語，好好嘅跟隨，你人生一定係無恩。2021年一定係無恩。
So God's words, you just have to follow God's instructions, and follow them and, in the new year, like 2021.
神嘅應許帶俾，最後提醒我哋，帶俾我哋唔係單係期望一個好美嘅圖畫，而係帶俾我哋人生裏邊一個好深層次嘅一個反省。
So God's promise are not just there for us, to feel happy about, but indeed, God's promises are there, for us, to reflect.
常常要提醒我哋要行喺正確嘅道路裏邊。
To always remind us that, we have to keep ourselves walking, in a righteous way.
好似約書亞一樣。
Like Joshua himself.
約書亞俾咗個選擇，當時以色列人，你要侍奉嘅去行啦。
Joshua gave the Israelites a choice.
但約書亞話：至於我和我家，我們必定侍奉耶和華。
But yet, Joshua said, as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord.
呢個係咪你嘅心願？係咪你嘅期望？係咪你整個嘅人嘅擁抱？
Would this be, your hope, and your commitment, something that you would embrace?
2021年
2021,
我哋唔知道嘅前路，
we are unsure of, what lies ahead.
但係我知道邊個掌管住你同我嘅前路。
But yet I trust, who takes hold of you and my kind of future ahead.
弟兄姊妹，就讓我哋一齊找住神嘅應許。
And brother and sister, let's kind of seize hold onto God's promise.
擁抱神自己嘅應許，繼續嘅前行。
To embrace God's promise to us and continue to walk on.
喺2021年裏邊，
In the year 2021,
得着神俾你自己各樣嘅祝福。
to reap of all the benefits and blessings God has bestowed upon you.